All right, so my name is Patricio Duran. This is the SOTU, or at least my SOTU speech analysis assignment. I chose to do President Reagan's of 1984 and President Obama's of 2014. And this was actually the first time I had really even just watched the State of Union address. So it was pretty interesting to see kind of or at least get a better understanding of how presidents communicate their priorities with the American public and such. Uh, Quickly, because I'm going to talk about this more later, but I found it kind of interesting. I also wanted to preface this, but I found it kind of interesting the political climates that were very obvious during this speech, where President Reagan's was very kind of unifying. It seemed like it was very accepted by the opposing party, whereas kind of President Obama's seemed like there was very obvious kind of divisiveness with the opposing party, where there was moments where they were not even standing up, clapping, or as as they were in President Reagan's kind of speech. So I found it very different in that aspect, and really just kind of noticed that almost immediately. But anyways, since we're short on time, moving forward, kind of the big ticket items that I found in President Reagan's speech was definitely the kind of the emphasis on the fiscal responsibility moving forward with his administration, as well as kind of that the second thing being kind of his focus on peace through strength via kind of diplomatic foreign affairs with the Soviet Union. Back then, it was a very crucial time considering the Cold War and the kind of the nuclear arms race and such. And really, this kind of the supporting policy ideas for these were kind of again reducing government spending, the deficit, kind of encouraging deregulation of government, and ultimately kind of avoiding the increased taxation on the American public. Um, Moving forward to President Obama's speech, two key issues. One being kind of his idea of strengthening the middle class. He drew a lot of reference to this throughout the entirety of the speech. Um, and the second key issue I found was kind of his intent with climate change, where it was very noticeable that his tone and his verbiage became more stern as he was discussing those, or at least that topic. But really, all in all, the speech was kind of based around investing in working families, expanding kind of economic middle class prosperity, and those kind of environmental kind of concerns and such. Um, where again, they spoke with kind of strong conviction and real stern with those key issues. At least both presidents were. Um, but yeah, moving forward, I thought that both of those, I found that through my research from like research articles from the Brookings Institute as well as the Economic Policy Institute, that it kind of almost seemed like both provided mixed results, both short term and long term, as far as kind of President Reagan's fiscal responsibility, or sorry, fiscal policy. He he did enact the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Budget Act of 1985 and 87, where that was targeted to reduce the federal deficit. And as far as the foreign policy concerns with, or at least the diplomatic affairs with the Soviet Union, now Russia, he kind of relied a lot on, it seemed, national security decision directives to help guide those negotiations and such. Um, to really just avoid, obviously, nuclear conflict, which would benefit all of civilization. Um, so yeah, mixed results, and more so, especially in kind of the long term. Um, so like for example, you know, we look at today, 2026, where the national deficit is at, I think, almost 40 trillion, and as far as the Soviet Union, now Russia, um, we're at a heightened state of diplomatic affairs with them, considering their invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So obviously things are a little kind of squishy there. As far as kind of President Obama's success. Um, One of the good things that he passed, I found, was kind of the Protecting Americans from Tax Hikes Act of 2015, which include the child tax credit. Obviously, that's still used today. Um, and then his commitment and kind of in securing the Paris Climate Agreement, which included over 100 nations. And again, long term, I find mixed results here. Whereas kind of the tax credit is still used, but the, the 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 Paris Climate Agreement is, you know, I think with obviously he secured that, and then the following administration, um, well, it's just been a mix of going in and out of that agreement. Whereas now, in 2026, if I'm not mistaken, if my research serves me correct, we are not even in the agreement. So, which is pretty alarming considering I think we're one of the nations with the biggest kind of footprint as far as emissions and such. So again, mixed results. Um, Moving forward, I found that I rated overall the both of their speeches to be relatively high in my opinion. I found that President Ronald Reagan's was obviously very unifying. I didn't think, however, obviously I don't think that it was really in a polarizing climate as President Obama's was, but he was very charismatic and great at kind of unifying and getting everyone kind of behind kind of his intents or his intent moving forward. Whereas President Obama's I also rate very high on the scale. His was very personable, and though it kind of started off very divisive, it kind of seemingly concluded in a very unifying manner, which I felt was great. And in his being personable, President Obama's, he during multiple occasions in his address, he was kind of directly acknowledging, a military service member, a small business owner, um, with regards to raising their minimum wage, and then a person who was affected by kind of health issues, who found help with kind of his policy regarding health insurance and stuff like that. And moving forward, I felt that much of the issues discussed in these speeches are still relevant today. Obviously, for example, like we mentioned, the Russia-Ukraine conflict of 2022. Obviously, there's issues there as far as kind of our diplomatic foreign affairs and geopolitics, as well as the middle class is still kind of seemingly getting, is not in a good spot with kind of the rise of inflation and really it outpacing kind of the middle class. And yeah, so very relevant, much of everything that was mentioned, especially these key issues. Um, I found that I guess I really already mentioned this, but the biggest difference with the two speeches was that I found almost apparent, almost right away, was again the divisiveness between the opposing party with President Obama's versus Reagan's. That being said, obviously the VPs in both speeches were very, ex- accepting in what the president was kind of laying out as far as discussion, um, as well as kind of the Speaker of the House in both instances. Um, but yeah, um, obviously to kind of cap this all off, again, President Reagan really focused on America's overall kind of strength, prosperity, and fiscal responsibility and national security, where really President Obama's was more personable in that it focused on strengthening the middle class and addressing kind of the long-term challenges of climate change. And that being said, kind of my final thoughts is I really enjoyed this assignment. Again, I never really reviewed the State of Union speeches like this before, let alone even watch them. So this was a good learning experience, especially through this perspective. And probably moving forward, I'll begin to watch them. So thank you very much for your time. Um, have a good evening.